morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very pleased today to welcome Savanah Knockwood, Indigenous Student Programs Coordinator here at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, based out of the UBC Vancouver campus. She's going to talk to us a little bit today about financial awards for post-secondary institutions and how we can go about getting them, and a whole bunch of other related information. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. As I say always, trigger warning here, some of the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. If you feel the need to step out, if you need to take a moment to yourself, please feel free to do so. Talk to a friend, elder, counselor, family member, whatever you need. Please engage in some self-care. So, team introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the session today, participating in the discussion. The other Learning Circle team member today in the room, but off camera, is Cynthia, our production coordinator. And I know I normally do the introductions, but I think it's really hard for me to do that for Savanah. You're just so accomplished, and you got so much to say, so I figured I'd just turn the mic over to you.
Cool, yeah, thank you. So I want to say hello to everyone watching now, and also hello to anyone watching in the future when this goes on YouTube. So get that greeting. Thank you so much for having me here today in your Learning Circle. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is I'm going to say it's a fun topic, but I also know that applying to things and writing stuff sometimes can't be fun. But I think it's exciting because free money is great. So a little bit about me. I am a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation. I'm originally from New Brunswick, and I moved to British Columbia in 2011. I went to UBC. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Korean Studies, and now I recruit students to health programs, which is crazy. And I work specifically with Aboriginal students in the 22 health science programs at UBC that aren't medicine. So there's a lot, I think, that's really cool and exciting and fun to happen here today. We're going to cover a lot in this awards workshop. I'm hoping that it's accessible and we have an hour and a half so we can really kind of dive deep, flesh things out. What we're going to kind of be looking at today is we're going to do a little bit of an overview of things like terminology. So talking a little bit about how to look for things, how universities define things. We're going to talk about how to find awards. So ways that you might not have thought of to kind of look for what to apply to. And then I'm going to talk for the rest of the session really about the components of applying to awards. So that's going to be the biggest things people ask questions about. So that's your reference letters, your statements of intent. And then I really want to take some time to kind of talk about being Indigenous in the academy and what that means. And really to touch on that, because I think it's something very important that isn't really talked about in the work that we do, that I try to touch on when I work with students and now as we work with community. So as we kind of move forward with this, the other thing I wanted to touch on is that all of the information I'm going to give you, I come from a UBC context. This is where I work. This is kind of just where my knowledge comes from. But the information that I'm giving is going to be very general. There'll be things there that you can take and you can use really in any award you apply to in multiple contexts. So not just for UBC, I wanted it to be as open as possible for community members, students from other schools who might be listening or watching later.
Great.
I don't know how many people we have, if there's people in the chat, but I kind of wanted to, now that I've quickly run down what we're going to talk about, if there's any expectations that people have, specific things that they want to see covered that I might not have put into it specifically, that I can make sure that we note and touch on as we go through the session. And if not right now, that's okay. I think there's a chat that people can kind of throw things into.
Feel free to type up anything that you think about or anything you want to see tonight, and we'll make sure that it gets addressed at some point throughout the conversation. Cool.
Okay. Should I just dive in?
I think let's just start. Yeah,
okay.
That's good.
So the beginning is going to be a little bit, honestly, for this kind of terminology piece, a little bit just me words heavy. If you have any questions, interject. I think the easiest place to start is talking about terminology because it kind of makes no sense. So at UBC, we use the word award, which kind of covers anything that isn't a student loan, that's money you could get for school. And then we define it into like broken down sections. The two biggest ones you'll see are scholarships and bursaries.
Right.
And then awards. So I know you were a student here. I don't know when you were a
Was.
student, if you knew what the difference between any of that was.
When I first started, no, I didn't really have an idea.
Yeah.
I knew that scholarship was something that you got based on like academic merit or like, getting really good grades. But I didn't know anything beyond that.
Yeah.
And a big misconception I think that I held in the beginning was that only the top tier of students got scholarships, and that if I wasn't in the top tier, there wasn't really any point in applying. Is that in your experience? Is that true?
Not really, no. It depends on the award, and it also depends on the school. So that's where all of the terminology becomes important and also is so vague for students.
Right.
So at UBC, we use the term scholarship, and for us, that means a merit-based award. And when we say merit-based, what that means is usually those are the awards that are looking at your academic history. And there's rules around awards that you need to like look at to apply to, and that usually is around GPA,
right,
or failed classes. At UBC, our guidelines are very, I want to say vague, but I think it's above a certain average, maybe like 70 or something percent, and no failed classes. But the thing that students don't know is you can appeal any award. So what we do on our end at the center when I do our awards is I will take any applications from any students, and if the adjudication committee decides that they want this student should get this award, I'll submit it, and then I will do an appeal on that student's behalf. Okay. So the number one thing I tell students is apply always. Always apply. It's like the number one takeaway, I think, from the session today. Because if you don't apply, it's a 100% no. If you do apply, there's that 50-50 chance. That I think is the biggest one that students see. They see academic excellence or like top percent, and they just don't apply.
Yeah.
They're like, I don't have a chance for this.
Well, students are very busy.
Yeah.
Life is hard. People have other commitments, and then going through the process of applying for something you're not going to get is, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's like that time investment commitment. So if you think I don't have good grades, or I failed a class, or I have, at UBC we call it a W, if you drop out of a class after a certain deadline, that you won't be able to compete because you're not on a top tier of students. And that's, in my experience, not always the case, especially when we look at the awards that UBC has been setting up in the last few years. They've really taken into account how constraining the rules can be for Aboriginal students, international students, really kind of any students, and to kind of expand that. It's been work that we've been doing for a long time. So it's really exciting.
Cool.
The other area that gets confusing in terminology, so merit-based is a big one. At UBC, a bursary is money you get based off of financial need. It's generally not something you apply to. And award is an umbrella term, but it also is a specific term to mean not a scholarship, not a bursary, but an award that isn't merit-based. So you don't have to hit any of those rules.
Okay.
Yeah. And that the way that you can tell at UBC, at least, when you read through, should I apply to this? If something says scholarship, then they're looking at your grades, etc. But you can appeal. And then award is everything else. And it's not a bursary. And it's very confusing. But that's kind of our breakdown. The place you can go, so if you don't go to UBC, all universities have something called an academic calendar. It's usually online. And if you Google it and say, like, your school name, scholarships, academic calendar, you'll get a page that will then tell you your school's description of what that means, and then their rules, which can be very helpful, I think.
So for people that are maybe thinking about applying to university, then you would just, if you have, let's say, 3 schools that you were hoping to apply to, then your suggestion would be to look at the academic calendars for each of those institutions to see if there's any entrance scholarships, that sort of thing.
So the academic calendar is more to get the definition, to know how that school defines it. That'll give you the ability when you're reading through like names of awards, what to apply to. At UBC, we have a whole page for students coming in where it shows you all the scholarships you can apply to, the timetables. There's a search that isn't in the calendar, but using that information about the definition will help you as you look through to think, what should I check off? What should I apply to? if that makes
If
sense.
we're talking about managing our time correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. Okay.
It gives you that like extra kind of knowledge piece. And that's also something your advisors can help with.
Okay.
At your school is kind of working through that.
Great. We have quite a few questions already.
Oh, cool. That's exciting.
So I'm just going to run some of them by
let's
you.
Go for it.
And if we're going to talk about them later,
yeah,
we'll address that. So Barb, thanks very much for your question. I'd like to learn about specific opportunities for awards for Indigenous students, specifically for students who are Indigenous but without status or specific band affiliation. Will we be going over that later, or should we address that now?
I'm looking at my list of things. So this is actually in the next How to Find Awards is something that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about that as well in the ending piece about
status and all that sort of stuff. Okay,
yeah.
Great. So if you wouldn't mind, Barb, we'll touch on that in a moment. Hudson, hello. I'm wondering if there are any awards available at UBC specifically targeted to Métis students.
Ooh. Specifically targeted.
Or are we going to talk about that later as well?
Oh, no, that actually I had to stop and think about it because we're not really going. I don't think we're talking about that specific question. Do you? I think I'll answer that now. If that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I actually don't know the answer to that off of the top of my head. The way it is at UBC is that the way that we define Aboriginal, and we'll touch on that in the self-identity piece, but we use in the spirit of the Canadian Constitution. So we are using it as an umbrella term to cover all First Nations, Aboriginal, Inuit, status, non-status, Métis people in Canada. So unless you see an award that and you generally won't, Métis students can apply to these awards at UBC.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Okay.
But I don't know
their
one.
Métis card or?
It depends on the award, and we'll touch on that a little bit in the ending piece. We'll talk about self-identity, and what we call proof of ancestry.
Okay, great.
And how that comes into play.
Thanks,
I don't know if that was helpful. But.
Thanks for the question, Hudson. Great one. And then Sabrina, I would like to know about additional graduate awards for Indigenous and Métis students. She's an RRU grad student and already have an Ike Barber graduate scholarship. However, the $5,000 doesn't cover the expensive graduate tuition. So are we going to cover grad stuff specifically, or are we going to highlight some of those things, or?
I'm going to write down. I'm writing notes to make sure I don't forget. That's a really good question. Thank you for all of these. These are awesome. I'm assuming that RRU is Royal Roads University.
Yeah, I would assume so.
I think we can cover that a little bit later because the section list will fit. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then one last one. Are there awards available for part-time student, or do you have to be a full-time student to apply? I know a lot of people are kind of juggling multiple things. If you're working and you have a family at home and you're studying part-time.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. It really depends.
Okay.
I can speak to UBC specifically. It depends on other schools. And also at UBC, it really depends. We call it a program. So that's like what you're taking. If that's arts or science or medicine or dentistry.
Right.
At UBC, you need to be a registered and a full-time student to apply to the majority of our awards. But that's based on the definition of your program, which is usually defined is the government definition that student loans uses. So for example, at the undergraduate level, it's a 60%. In arts, it's a 60% credit limit, which is 3 classes. You're a full-time student. Where it gets tricky is for the merit-based awards. It comes into, there's credit limits about if you are able to get that award. And it used to be at UBC 27 in 1 year. Now it's 24. So students can take 4 classes per year, or per term, pardon me, and still be able to apply to merit-based scholarships. However, at UBC, when you become a graduate student, the Senate rules no longer apply to you.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's some interesting stuff about grad students that can be tricky.
So I assume we'll chat about some of that stuff later. Okay, so we'll move on. We have another question here, but we'll touch on it. Thank you very much, Andrea. We'll touch on it in a second. We'll move on to some of these other things that we're talking about, and then we'll come back around to it.
Totally. One of the questions that I get is how to find awards. How do I know what to apply to? How do I find things? And I think in my notes I wrote crafty Google searches.
Right.
So one of the first things that I always recommend that people do is just throw things into the internet machine and see what sticks, if that makes sense. So I'll usually tell students when I do these presentations live that you can put into Google Aboriginal student scholarships, and then the name of your university, and then use Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, your community, any variation to see what gets pulled up, because you'll find things that may not otherwise show up, if that makes sense, doing it that way. Oftentimes, sometimes, like depending on where you're from. So in British Columbia, there's multiple scholarships that are open to you if you're a member of a BC First Nation, for example, that you could apply to. I think it's through the Union of, I can't remember, it's like Union of First Nations Chiefs or something, have some scholarships that are fairly well funded, that kind of you can only apply to if you're from here, and they often don't require you to be going to school in BC. So for example, I'm from New Brunswick. There was scholarships I could apply to that were funded for New Brunswick students, even though I was living and now live here. So that's one thing that I think can be really interesting, especially if you know how to search really well. The other thing I like to tell students is get on as many listservs as you can. So at UBC, we have a listserv called the Talking Stick. I have an arts degree, so arts had one called The Post, which is very fun. I did an Asian Studies major, so Asian Studies has their own. And what happens is when jobs, scholarships, any opportunities come up, they go into these listservs. The problem is students don't often read or like open email. So I always reiterate to students, it's very important, even open these and see, because that's where you'll get those inside tips about apply to this award. This is what's coming up. Your department will have that kind of information for you, especially if you have an Aboriginal student service, like a center, gathering space, advisors at your university or school that you work with. They're an amazing resource. Cool. I utilize them a lot. The other thing I tell, and I realize this is very specific, if you are a status and you have a band, or non-status, but you have a band education coordinator, they often will know about scholarships. And sometimes, depending on the band, I know this is so highly dependent, especially in BC, because there can be so much variation, but that can be a really, really good resource as well. Sometimes they'll have listservs. I know that my band education coordinator would send things out through emails for us. I wasn't in New Brunswick, so I couldn't attend, but she would do things for like Inspire, who is the largest provider of post-secondary funding for Indigenous students outside of the Canadian government. That is from their website. That's their direct quote. But their application process is hard and confusing. So our band coordinator would hold like workshops so students could apply together. Cool. Through my pillar at our center, I'll do things like that with students as well. Cool. And then also there's websites that will have things. So a big one is Scholarships Canada, where you can search through and look for things. UBC, we have a huge award database that we put online. The problem is sometimes things can be a little bit outdated, but it's doing that initial sifting. And the really big awards, I think there's RBC, Canada Post, Inspire, IKB, things through UBC, they'll almost always be funded kind of forever. And then you're good to go once you find it. And then I have my moral, apply to everything. Which becomes easier, and that's what we'll kind of touch on in the rest of this. One of the things I hear so much from students is is the time investment. They're like, there's so much to do, there's like so much time invested. And what I tell students, especially when we touch on it later, when you have a really good, we call them a statement of intent or a letter of intent or a personal essay. Once you have a really good one, and kind of template, you can copy and paste, mix and match, update it every year. It's just doing that initial kind of writing that can be a little bit overwhelming. That's what I did when I was in post-secondary. I got funding through Inspire basically every year, and I just updated my same letter when I sent it to them with kind of, here's what I'm doing, but it had that same idea. Cool. And it worked really well.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I know Savanah went through a bunch of different resources there. Yeah. We're taking notes on the side, and we will have all of these things laid out for you. So a lot of these websites you're talking about, just to make sure that everybody can access those resources as much as possible. And Cody says, don't forget about the new Relationship Trust Foundation. So there we go. See, there's tons of resources that we can access as a community, and we'll try to make sure that we get as many of these resources as possible together for you guys.
Hi, Cody.
Okay, so do you mind if we take some more questions?
100% no. Let's go for it.
Hudson has another group. Are there limits to how many awards one can apply for? And if so, do the limits reset every year? Or are you aware of anything like that?
It depends on what you mean by limit. So
Let's say if we're assuming limit of the number of applications, let's say.
No.
No. What about number of
I would
awards
say no.
won?
No.
No?
It depends. And we'll put it this way: we go for awards won. It depends. If you mean awards everywhere, so if you're applying to what we would call external awards, so not within UBC, but like a new relationship trust, Inspire,
right.
and you're getting all of this funding. If you're a grad student, you might get we call them SHRC, CIHR, and CIRC. They're the big three government funding councils. Don't really need to know what the acronyms mean, but it's basically the government funding research for health, science, and then arts, social sciences. They have their own rules that are completely different, and then those interact with the institution. But outside awards, no, you're kind of good there, unless it's from those big three. But then you're a grad student, it's a whole different ballgame. In terms of limits internally at UBC, what sometimes can happen is we've had students who come in and they get like, let's use a student coming in from high school. So we've had cases where we've had students who come in from high school and they get offered multiple. They get what we call a major entrance scholarship, and then they get a few other scholarships all at once. They get a huge amount of funding. So what UBC will do, right? So we have the Centennial Scholarship and the Major Entrance Scholarship are our two big incoming student scholarships at UBC. And what we'll do is if a student gets, we call it an MES, Major Entrance, if they get that scholarship and then others, UBC will offer the student the most money, the best scholarship for them. So you can accept, if you get an MES and it renews every year and it pays your tuition and it's like $10,000 or $20,000, that's obviously the scholarship you want to take, right? So you'll get that scholarship, and the rest you can accept in name. So you get the notation that it was offered to you at this amount, but you don't usually get that funding if they're merit-based. What happens is UBC, because we want to be able to fund as many students as possible and have as many students be able to access the institution, will release the funding to other students. And that's one of the cases, but it's still good to apply and get those, because when we talk about in name, it goes on your transcript. So later on in your education career, when you're applying to like medical school, because I work in health, or grad school, you need to make like a resume of your accomplishments. You can list those awards that you got these, because those committees were like, the student's amazing. It's just you didn't also take that funding. But outside awards, no. And then grad students, it can get a little tricky, depending on your school, and that's so UBC specific. For us, I can't really. The general advice would be, make sure if you're getting funding from your university to do your grad school, check with your grad advising department to make sure that you're not forfeiting your, what we call at UBC, a fellowship, by getting other funding.
Okay, great. So there's a lot of stuff.
I hope that was helpful. There's so much here. If I go too quick, let me know and I'll dial it back. I always forget how much I know about these things.
So we have one other question from Andrea from before. Thank you, Andrea. Hello, they offer free tuition in Germany, provided that you can support yourself. What do you think about that in terms of, I guess, just generally, or how it applies to the
what do I think about that? Well, I am all for everyone having free access to education, quite frankly, if we're talking about personal opinions. I just think that having a well-educated, like, populace, is such a net benefit for society. Like, regardless, that I'm all for it, but I know that that's not usually something that we do in Canada. But to me,
North America in general.
North America, and to me, I think it's just something that is so good. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
Cool.
I don't know if that was a helpful answer, but
cool. There was actually one thing I wanted to add on to the vein of Hudson's question is, if you're in the middle of applying for things, and I know that some of the scholarship we talked about, obviously merit-based awards, like in terms of academic excellence, there are others like the bursaries, I believe, that are more financial needs-based. If we're applying for multiple awards, at any point do you consider, like, if they're all due on, let's say, a Friday, but you're writing 3 or 4 of them, and if you win 1 or 2 of them, then your financial situation changes a lot, right? And then do you ever think about that as you're applying, or?
That's a really good question. So, and this is one that actually comes up a lot when I get students who are applying to Inspire, because they're looking for a budget. And what I tell students is, and for our awards specifically, because we at the center ask for a financial needs statement for some of our awards, we're not going to check. And at the time you're applying for the award, you don't have that money. You don't know if you're going to get it. So it's not really part of your planning. It's like potential future money you may or may not get. It doesn't really have any bearing on what's happening right now. Cool. So I tell students, I think Inspire will ask you what other scholarships you know you're getting, but I don't think they ask you the other ones you've applied to.
Okay.
So I tell students, don't take that into account. And also, when you're figuring out your budget, especially for Inspire, students almost always underestimate it. They have limits like that are much higher, and I can't remember what they are because I think they change every year. That are larger than students think that they are. And Inspire, if you contact them and when they go out and do workshops, they will tell students, like, just put the max amount because they're not going to check, and it's better for you as a student because things can happen you may not know about. And if you do get extra funding from these sources, it just puts you in a better position, I think. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
That was helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the kind of next part of this, where we're going to talk a little bit about, I call them common components of award applications, right? Things that show up a lot that trip students up.
Okay.
And here I have reference letters and statements of intent. And then just some general stuff. So before we dive into those, students often will get confused about the budgets. So we touched on that a little bit. If there's more questions about budgets, throw them in. If like application forms can trip students up, and that's so dependent on the individual award, that students are just like, I don't know what to do with all these forms. Yeah. But if there's specific questions about application forms students have and attendees have, just throw them in there. And then we touched a little bit about, for grad students, sometimes they'll ask for your CV, which is something you do in grad school. I don't know how many people are in grad school. And sometimes we'll get questions about that. To be completely honest, that's not my field of expertise, and I usually pass those questions off to someone else who's more adept at helping with CVs, but that's something grad students need to take into account as well. It's how to write a really strong CV. Okay. So where do you think we should start? Reference letters or statements of intent? Because I think statements of intent tie in nicely to the last piece.
Sure. We can start with reference letters then.
Okay, let's dive in. Reference letters. I don't know if you have any questions or anything you're wondering about.
I think generally, like, to establish, like, most awards that you were going to apply to will require a reference letter, or at least in my opinion they did. Or in my case they did.
Yes.
Do you find that to be the case as well?
It really depends. Right. For us at the center, some of our awards need reference letters, some need 2. So we have a grad research award. That one needs 2. And we have some that don't need them at all. UBC is the same, especially for entrance scholarships. You're considered as part of your application. But I think reference letters are the thing that really trips students up when they see it. They just kind of are like, nope. And it's just kind of like the barrier, the wall for them. It's really hard.
They're really hard to get. To keep up, like keep maintained and all that sort of stuff.
So, because I think you applied to like a ton, I assume you applied to a ton of awards when you were a student. What was it about reference letters that was like the biggest hurdle for you?
For me, once you're into post-secondary, and I'm sure a lot of people in the chat box can kind of relate to this as well, is that a lot of the Indigenous specific awards I applied to required reference letters and all these sorts of things. And most of the time they were looking for what they called like an academic reference letter, which was something that was very specific. It was only I needed to get it from a professor or for somebody that taught me. And if you go to a larger institution, like UBC or SFU or U of C or U of A or, any of these large institutions, that becomes really unattainable really quickly. If we're talking about sitting in lectures with 100 or 200 people, is the professor going to write you a reference letter? I find it difficult. I found it difficult to get. In some smaller institutions or things that are more hands-on or small class-based, then I think that might not be as much of an issue. But for me, that was a really big hurdle being at UBC, is like building that relationship and trying to find people that would be appropriate reference letters.
I think that's like the number one thing, especially when you're coming in. So if you are either coming to UBC like as a transfer student from a smaller school.
Transfer from Langara, for example.
Or if you're coming directly from high school, which we now have, I think, over half of our incoming student population now is coming directly from high school to UBC for our Indigenous students, which is super cool and exciting.
That's really awesome.
But yeah, then especially if you're at UBC in your first year class, if you're in, you got like sometimes a few hundred students.
Most of the time,
yeah. So what I tell students is this. If you're looking for an academic reference and you're coming directly from high school, you can use a high school teacher that knew you in high school, especially if you're like your first semester of university.
Mm-hmm.
That's completely fine, because usually what happens is the adjudication committees see your application. They see you're in your first year of university, and with that context in mind, they'll then look at your application. So they wouldn't compare a first year university student with like a lovely reference from their high school teacher with like a PhD student with like 2 academic references from their supervisor. It's not even fair.
Yeah.
So we look at each student in their context,
Right.
at least in the committees I've been in and the ones I've heard about.
Right.
The other thing I tell students, so find people who would know you that would be appropriate for the award, and then really good ways to make connections with professors, especially if you're in like really, really, really big classes. It can be really scary for students.
Yeah.
Go after class and talk to the prof. Ask them a question. If they have office hours, go to office hours. If there's a course with a really, like, it's big and there's a TA who does labs or what we call UBC tutorials, ask that TA. If you go to that tutorial regularly, you go to that lab regularly, they're grading your work, they can be an academic reference for you in that capacity while you're working your way through building up more academic connections. And then getting into those courses. That's how I connected with my profs who had to write me, who I then used to do reference letters so I could do cool stuff at UBC or get awards. And it was really through that process of reaching out to them after or going to their office hours. And I know going to office hours can be really scary for students because they sometimes are like, what do I talk about? What do I ask?
Yeah.
And I've heard some students will be like, how can I make the prof know that I'm really smart? And it's like, well, you are very smart, but also I think if you go with a willingness to learn and to ask them questions and learn from them, you'll make more of an impression on that prof. So then they'll know you when you're like, hey, I'm in your class. Could you write me this reference letter? They'll be more equipped to remember you and kind of have that space.
Cool.
I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
My next question would be, in your experience, these reference letters, what are we shooting for in terms of length, in terms of thoroughness of the, there's a really big difference that even if you're talking about small class sizes, right? If you're chatting with your professor about writing you a paragraph as opposed to writing pages.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So what are awards typically looking for? Is there something they're looking for in terms of length or thoroughness of the letter?
Yeah. So, and this is frustrating because not all awards do this. I made it a point with ours. I put our rubric online. You can see exactly what the adjudicators see when they are grading your award. With a reference letter, I usually think about a page. About a page, sometimes 2 is what we get from references, depending on how much they want to say. And this is also why it's really important to strategically pick your reference. So the one thing I will tell students, and the reason why I say if it's an academic reference, ask a teacher who knew you in high school if you're coming. Because I've had students who are in their first year of university who used their manager from their job at Tim Hortons because they were like, well, it's like a reference, it needs to be this. And your manager at your job at Tim Hortons, while lovely, knows you in a context of work and not the context of academia. So it won't be as strong of a reference. They won't speak to the things that you would need. So part of it is being strategic about who you're asking. One question I do get from students a lot is, can I use community references? Sometimes, especially if you're applying to Indigenous specific awards for Indigenous students,
absolutely.
They'll say that you can use a community reference as well if you don't have an academic reference. And it's usually someone who knows you in the context of community. And for us, I say however that's defined for you, because I'm aware at UBC we have a lot of students who aren't from, they're not at their home community. So I've
haven't been for years.
Yeah, or haven't been for years, like myself. So I've had students who've given reference letters from clinics they've worked at in the downtown east side working with Aboriginal women, and that's their community right now doing that work. If that makes sense. It really just comes down to, can your reference speak to what's in the rubric or what's in the description that's being graded on. And this actually ties very nicely into the second half of this space, is how do you ask someone for a reference? How how do you make it so that they're going to say yes and write you a strong reference? So what I tell students is a couple things. Go through that award application online and really look at what they're looking for, especially if they give you a rubric or if there's a section that says reference letters. When I ask for references, I'll print out the award description, is what we call it, what they're looking for, things in the rubric that are important, what they're looking for from a reference. So some will give you word limits for those lengths, some won't. And then I'll highlight the things that I know are really important. And then I'll give them kind of like either my resume or if they haven't seen me for a little bit, like a bio.
Right.
About how like this is what I've been doing and like this is what I did for you and how I think this sit here. Never offer to write the letter for your reference because the best reference letters are the ones that are written by the reference. And very often for most awards, those letters need to come directly to me or directly to the committee, not coming through the student, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So if I can just jump in here, we actually have a question related to that.
Exciting.
Denali, thank you for the question. I've been asked when you're being asked to write these reference letters by the supervisors, and I've had that kind of interaction where you're like, hey, could you write me a reference? And the other person's like, well, write it up and I will do something about it. Denali asks, how do I do this effectively? How do I negotiate this sort of thing? Is there something, you know what I mean? Do you have any words of wisdom to impart there?
This is a really hard one. I think I would have, for me personally, I would have a conversation. Like I would really ask the reference who's like, "Can you write this for me?" What they're looking for, and if it's a time, like what exactly their needs are in that moment.
Writing,
yeah. Like what are they looking for? If it's a time commitment. Maybe seeing if there's someone else who can be your reference. If not, seeing how you can make it work. So ultimately, it's getting that piece of paper.
Yeah. Of course.
But also, it's making sure that, like, at the very least, they can kind of submit it for you, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's really hard because professors are busy. People who do references are
and
sometimes
they're asked
busy.
By sometimes, dozens, if not
exactly.
a lot of people.
And I think also sometimes when they're asking you write the reference letter, it's because you're just coming up and being like, hey, can you write me a reference? And they're like, they might not remember you in that moment. They're like, I don't know. Like, I need that context. So I think if you're, hi, can you write this reference for me? Here's your reminder of who I am. Here's the award and here's how I hit this. It'll be easier for them.
Right.
And I don't know, Denali, if you've been in those cases, if you've been talking to someone and been like, here's all this context.
Yeah.
And if so, then I would start kind of thinking, okay, cool, how do we make this work? What are our needs here to really see and work through? I don't know if that was helpful.
This is my PhD supervisor.
So I think at that point, if you're a PhD supervisor, it's a different ballgame at that point. And I'm going to be completely honest. Yeah. I am not super, I don't do a lot of work with PhD students in this spectrum. If I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know if I don't feel qualified to fully answer your question in a way, but let me think about it. There may be someone that I could ask and get some knowledge in there to include later. If you provide your email, I might be able to connect you, something like that. Because I think it's a really important question and I don't want it to go unanswered.
Absolutely.
I don't know the answer.
Absolutely. No, you can private message us or email us that contact information and we'll make sure to connect you to.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Do you mind if we do a couple other questions?
Not at all. Let's go for it.
Okay, so they're a little bit off their reference because people are just kind of asking what they need. But so Andrea asked bursaries, which I think is a great question because I've been doing this myself. I have a good job right now, but I may take a year or two off to pursue further education. Then I won't be as well off.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about applying for bursaries, Andrea asked, could I apply for a bursary then? You know what I mean? Like, does Andrea wait to apply for the bursary once she doesn't have that income?
Yeah.
Or what would be your suggestion?
Oh.
Because obviously you want to try and make your income continuous so that you don't have to go through that period where it's really tough.
Exactly. It's really hard because a lot of these systems, especially at UBC, work off of the student loan system. And I'm not as well versed at student loans. It's been a while since I've had one. But from what I recall, they usually use your income tax, like how much money you made the year previous, or sometimes like if you're coming directly from high school and you still have your parent, like it can be
they'll
really
ask what your
hard.
parent
Yeah.
incomes are. Yeah.
And they'll use that calculation to see what your financial need is. And like they calculate that based off of this is how much your program is, this is how much you'll get from loans and like how much you've had from saving, working income, etc. And then this is the amount you need. And they're quite frankly, it's a system that I think doesn't really work for anyone because it doesn't take into account those specific areas. It's also really hard because each university has their own mechanisms in place. So the best thing that I can suggest to be is whatever school you go to, if it's UBC, if it's a different institution, is really contact your schools at UBC. We call them enrollment services advisors. The name changed recently, or your school's financial aid office. Again, if you have an advisor you work with, like in your program, if there's an Aboriginal student specific advisor, they'll be a lot more qualified to give you the exact answer in your specific case about what to do with that and how to apply and how to really maximize the funding that you'll be getting for school, especially in those gap years.
Okay.
Hope that was helpful.
So each institution is going to have these people, enrollment service advisors, is what we call them at UBC. But ultimately, the answer would be to search those people out, and they would have more specific information for each institution you're going for, because the mechanisms of bursary awarding, I guess, is so different between institutions and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay, great. So then Justin just had like a general question about you and the way that you work. So when guiding students towards Aboriginal awards, do you personally use an internal and external award list to come up with what is best for them? And the list that has been created through the institution, because obviously one barrier that many students identify is how to find and access relevant awards, not huge lists of awards, but awards that are relevant to them. So just generally, how do you approach this in your job at UBC?
So I'm unique in my job at UBC in that I work in a very specific niche. So I work with students in health, and I think right now our enrollment's around, it's like maybe around 300. So
across all health programs?
Yeah. Okay. Which is really good.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
That's very, very exciting and very good. So because it's a little bit more, I don't have to I'm not a general advisor and I have students in science and in arts and I have to have these huge lists. I can have very specific, very targeted approaches to the students I work with. So if I see things that I think, especially if I know a lot of the students now and I see something like a student should apply to this, I'll just send it to them directly and be like, you should apply to this. This definitely is for you, which is one of the benefits of getting to know your advisors. They'll then think of you and nominate you for stuff, which is it's so incredibly helpful. And I know at UBC and the people that I work with, we get so many requests for things for students to do stuff for free money, basically, is what I like to call it. And it's always helpful to be like, I know this incredible student, and then to have a list on deck of the students that we know. So I can be really targeted, basically. I know what awards are coming through. I hear things from other people and I send it out. Cool. It can be harder when you're working on your own as a student, and that's why I always say there's resources if you're you have your advisors. At UBC, we have the First Nations Longhouse or House of Learning, that. Those spaces, specific advisors. There's a whole team of us who work with Aboriginal students, and connecting with those student affairs people who are there to help you and work with you is going to be so beneficial because they can really take that time, especially the financial services advisors.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so getting back into reference.
Cool.
I'm sorry to take this off.
Honestly, it's all good. I like it. It's very organic. I'm here for it. I'm going back through my list trying to remember if we touched on everything. I think we kind of have covered everything except for responding if a reference says no. That's something I hear from students a lot. And as someone who does get asked to be a reference, and I've been on kind of both sides of it, it's always it can always be hard to kind of both say no to someone and also accept a no. And the number one thing I tell students is go into the conversation knowing the person you ask might say no for whatever reason. And then graciously accepting the no, because it's probably not a no forever. It could just be a no for right now. And you really want to make sure that that connection is still there and you don't burn that bridge. Because I have heard anecdotes of students who have not reacted well to someone not writing them a reference and have lost that reference forever. And that really sucks, both for the person who has to say no, and then that's kind of the response that they get. Sometimes students will kind of argue with people and be like, well, why can't you do this for me? Especially if someone's written them a letter before.
Mm-hmm.
That can get a little sticky. So I think it's that just remembering that the people you're asking are also very busy humans on the planet with us doing a ton of different stuff, especially if they're faculty.
Yeah.
So that's why you want to make it as easy for them as possible. And then also preparing yourself. They could say no. And then how you respond to that. Sometimes I'll have students when I do these things live do role plays where they have to ask each other for references.
Mm.
And then sometimes I'll have them ask out a situation where a reference says no and how they deal with that. I think those are really useful tools to kind of play around and see what that's like, especially if I do this with high school students a lot who've never had to like ask for a reference.
Yeah.
And it like kind of, I don't know, I think it's a useful tool. I don't know if that was very helpful, but
No.
Yeah?
That's really helpful. I think that's really important point to note, right? Is that when we're asking for reference letters, is that, the people that we're asking, they're human. And they might also have family things going on. They might also have something going on outside of work that takes their time away, and they might not be able to fulfill that. But
yeah,
I totally agree. Being graciously accepting the no,
yeah,
always keeps that door open for later on, right? Or like I think that's really good as well if you're early on in university, or early in your faculty. If you're first year, second year, and you maybe ask a professor that's an upper year that maybe wasn't super appropriate,
Yeah.
but if you're gracious about it and you continue to excel or you continue to progress in your studies, that just opens that door later on, right? And it makes the reference when they do provide it a lot more organic, because they can speak to that aspect of your personality, right?
Yeah.
That you were gracious in accepting the no, or you have the humility and the internal fortitude, let's say, to take that and carry on. So thanks very much for that,
Oh,
Savanah.
you're welcome. I think the other thing that just sparked for me while you were talking is that there's also the chance that the person you asked who might say no or isn't like was super appropriate in that time could be like, I can't, but I know this person. And they may not offer that next, but I know, like, let me connect you. If you just immediately jump to, why won't you do this for me? Not saying that people will, but if that does come up, if you haven't prepared for that no. And the other thing I think is, it's like, is that there's not, especially when you work with Indigenous students, there's not a lot of us who do this work, and people talk to each other. And not just in this work, but kind of like in any work. So if you burn a bridge with one person, especially in smaller faculties or programs, there's the potential that you could be burning a bridge you don't even know about when other people, especially if you react very like just negatively. I'm not saying that people will, but it's just always something to keep in mind. It's that idea. It's really that idea of like community. As because I especially think at UBC that the ways that we work, especially like Indigenous, all of us who work with Indigenous students, we are really collaborative. We really work together. We have our students' best interests in mind. So if there's things that we're like, this was okay, what's up with that? Then we'll do our best to help students, but people also do talk. So it's always important to keep that in mind, I think, as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks
You're
for that.
welcome.
So we just have one question that
totally.
came up. June asks, do you know of awards specific for older women that are returning to school after some life experience? Is there any specific resources for those sorts of people?
That's a good question. The only thing I can think of, and this is just because it's specific to us, through our center, if people are coming back, we have an entrance award, and that entrance award is open to either students coming directly from high school or who are coming back to school after a gap.
Oh, okay. Great.
For students who are both in health programs or not health programs, but might want to do health in the future. That's the only one I know off the top of my head, but there's so much out there, even at UBC, I can't think of anything, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But that's, I don't know if there's like anybody in the chat who knows of anything or if there's resources, but that's a really good question.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as we've always done, feel free to contribute in the chat if you know the answer to the question. And we'll provide those resources that we talked about before, those award databases. Sometimes it just comes down to a search. But we'll also provide a link to the center awards as well, so you can check them out, all the ones that Savanah's name dropping. Yeah,
totally.
Cool.
I think I'm going to move to the statements of intent piece.
Sure.
If that's helpful. Because this is, I think, aside from reference letters, like the biggest part, and sometimes the only part of an award
Yeah.
application.
Yeah.
It's often where the majority of the weighting, like the grades you're going to get, comes from. And it's also super important because it's like the statement of intent, the letter of intent, the personal essay, whatever they call it, is like your chance to tell whoever is reading the award why you deserve that award.
Okay.
It's like it's the most valuable resource that you have.
It's your moment.
Yeah, it's your moment.
Yeah.
And it's also really hard to figure out how to best utilize that moment, I think. I'm wondering for you, like you applied to awards and you had to write these statements of intents. Was like as you were doing that as a student, were there things that you thought about? You were like, what's happening?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think for myself and probably for a lot of us, I find it very uncomfortable to talk myself up, to make everything seem a lot more grand than it actually is. So I found that part kind of difficult because when you're writing, like just like you said, it's your moment, and a lot of people have conflicting advice on whether or not to talk everything up or to just state it very factually. And I remember having a lot of issue with that component of it because it makes me very uncomfortable. And I'm sure that it makes a lot of people uncomfortable to write these really grand, kind of ridiculous, sentences and statements and paragraphs about yourself. But do you have any advice on that aspect of it?
Yeah, totally. That's like the number one thing. And really why I started talking about this piece when I call it indigeneity in the academy, really being Indigenous in systems that were not built for us, were not designed for us. And quite frankly, I don't think they ever wanted us to go to school. So, right? So it's how to navigate that in that space. Because I think Aboriginal ways of knowing knowledge, the ways that we walk through the world can be at odds with what is expected of us in these spaces.
An academic institution.
Yeah, in an academic institution. And it's the number one, especially I find at somewhere really big like UBC. Because we have a lot, I feel like there's a lot of messaging about like excellence and here's all the things we're doing, and it's just because we're a really large research institution, I feel like that pressure is even kind of higher. And it's figuring out how to navigate being true to yourself, but also making sure that you can access these funds. So the number one thing that I think about just in a statement of intent in general is, and this is probably, I don't know if this advice will be counter, but it's the number one thing that I think, is that it needs to be genuine. I think somebody, whoever it is, when they finish reading, if it's 500 words or 1,000 words about you, they need to know who you are. The best statements of intent are the ones where you come off reading it and you're like, either I want to know that person, or you're like, I feel like I know this person and what motivated them to apply for this, and like who they are, even within these small amounts of words, which sounds terrifying when you say it that way. But I always think that if you are genuine, that speaks much more than the idea of fake talking yourself up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's the number one thing I've seen when adjudication committees are reading these. It's the thing that I've seen when I read these kind of letters, is that when I come away from a letter and I'm like, wow, I know you, whatever that is, I will score you much higher. Like you just, like that's where it is. And I think it also, when you start thinking about writing personal essays, statements of intent, and having them be a reflection of who you are and how you see the world and how you approach the world and what you feel like you bring, rather than here's a list of my accomplishments and how great I am, it becomes a little bit easier to integrate that, to me, I don't want to speak for everyone, into your way of moving through the world. I think, especially when you're applying to Indigenous specific awards, because often, at least for us at the center, I create the adjudication committees, and the people that I put on the committees are people who either are Indigenous, so almost everyone on our committees are Indigenous themselves, or have done significant work with Indigenous community, understand the cultural context, and are very strong, knowledgeable allies in that space. Right. So they read the letters and they know that that specific area. It can be harder when you're doing things, especially if you're in grad school for like, um, we call them tri-councils. So earlier I was talking about like CHR, etc. That can be way harder
Hmm.
because you have to speak very prescriptively. But in something that's like a personal essay and it's
Hmm.
about you, I think you have that freedom to really go there.
Right.
But it can also still be hard. I feel like that was a very wishy-washy answer.
No,
But
I think that generally we're trying to hone in,
yeah,
try to be as genuine as you can at all
yeah,
times, and that's ultimately what I ended up doing. It worked out for me pretty well,
yeah.
but uh, I totally agree.
Hmm.
Just generally speaking, in the way that I tried to operate, the way that I tried to navigate this space, coming from a smaller community and living at UBC by
Yeah.
myself. There were difficult times, but I had a lot of support from my band, and ultimately I just tried to walk in a way that I knew would be good
Hmm.
for myself, and that I wouldn't it would be good for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Um, okay, Hudson has another question. Here we go. You may not have the correct answer on this, but do you know if you're going forward, there's an interest by UBC and other post-secondary institutions you've worked with in expanding Indigenous awards and sponsorships, scholarships, all those
Yeah.
sorts of things?
So I can say that BBC definitely it's something that we're really, I should say, I feel like we're always striving towards. A few years ago, you heard me mention earlier the Major Entrance Scholarship and the Centennial Scholarship. So the
Mm-hmm.
Centennial Scholars, like the awards, were awards were put into place for UBC's like 100th anniversary, and there was Centennial Scholarship set aside specifically for Aboriginal students within that. And those awards were set up in such a way so that they would be more accessible because
Great.
so many of our awards weren't, especially what we call the major entrance scholarships, because of the rules, they just weren't working
Yeah.
with the specific context that Indigenous students would come into university with.
Yeah.
So there's a for us, I should say at UBC, there's a huge push to really be striving and working towards that. And it's a lot of work from a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
Our scholarships, the at the center, we've grown from 2 when we started 5 years ago to now we have 9.
Right on.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So I think that there is, but I also think, as with everything, there's a lot that can be done as we move forward. But I also am seeing really exciting momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as we get more people like myself who are like we're young and we graduated from institutions and we know what the problems are and we're like, yeah, we're going to tackle this. And there's more Indigenous people working in all kinds of different spaces. I feel like we're just getting this really exciting momentum where we're all just like, what's up with this? And then we're moving towards that change. So
Yeah.
I think it is, but I also think these things also take time.
Cool.
But I've definitely seen it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks
I
for the
hope that
question,
helped.
Hudson.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, cool. So we can just, I guess, statement of intent. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, it's
Sidetracked us a little
okay.
bit, but.
I'm loving it. It's very, and I feel like it all flows together lovely in a
Mm-hmm.
lovely way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. I feel like when you look at the statement of intent, it's really it's ideas of like what's the content? What are committees looking for? How do you write a really good one? Like what is it?
Yeah.
And the best, like as I talked about, I think the best way to distill a statement of intent is like it's your chance to show the adjudication committee who you are and what you're all about
Right.
within the context of whatever that kind of award is. So if you're applying, so our awards are for Indigenous students. We talk about commitment to improving the health of Aboriginal people. I think we talk about sometimes some of them talk about leadership, which
Mm-hmm.
there's a whole thing about leadership, which is that I feel like it's the latest buzzword and was for a while. Like we want leaders, and no one knows what that means or what that looks like. I remember when I was like when I graduated, I got nominated for like a President's Leader Excellence Award as like a future leader, and I was like, I don't think I'm a leader. What?
Mm-hmm.
How are we defining this? Like, what is happening?
Mm-hmm.
And me and like some of my other friends who had these experiences, we all were like, how do we know that we're leaders? Like, what is that? And it was the number one thing.
Yeah.
So when I work with Indigenous students, I tell them if you are looking at something like leadership, you can be a leader in so many different ways. Like, are you in student clubs? Do you engage with like like for us, we have like the Longhouse. Do you go to the Longhouse? Are you engaging with like the Indigenous community on campus in some way? Do you we've had students who talk about like community connection. It's like sometimes students will be like, yeah, I like go hunting, or I've worked with elders who do this, or like I'm learning to do beading. I am like working on language revitalization, or I'm trying to learn. Like those things are leadership. It's
Mm-hmm.
just students don't think of them in that way. And you
Mm-hmm.
can really, they're just things that you are doing in your life to either honor yourself or honor your community, honor whatever, whatever.
Yeah,
And I think
totally.
that's leadership
Totally.
to make things better. So that's the one thing I see a lot with students. They don't know what that means. And they don't really understand how to parse and put together all the stuff that's in it. And often, like, rubrics can be really lengthy, and you're like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Totally. Yeah,
Right?
it's a lot.
Um, and it's hard to figure out what to do with that, especially sometimes if you're applying for an award that's not an Indigenous specific award as well. Because then you're like, well, what do I do with that? And then the whole thing just falls apart. And sometimes that I've seen, you can have students who write, um, we have students who apply to our year awards multiple years in a row, and sometimes like they have an amazing letter. It's like the letter they used before, and they got like funded a lot, but just the committee is different. There might be different needs. For us, we have the financial need component
Mm-hmm.
in our awards. So what that does is that there's two people who are tied, but someone has significant financial need. The committee has the ability to say, this person has significant financial need that could be a barrier to them succeeding. We think that they should get like this award will really, really help them.
Mm-hmm.
And they can decide how much students get. Sometimes you can write the best statement of intent and it just doesn't follow through for whatever that year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you're just stuck in the area of what's happening. So I already talked about content to include. What I did is I basically, and I don't know if this is helpful for people who are very busy, but it got me that template letter that I then was just able to use after I got a couple of awards. I was like, perfect, this letter's great,
Mm-hmm.
kind of. Let's just keep running with it.
Yep.
I found awards that I knew would always continue. And I took those awards and I looked through to see what are the major common components that they're looking for. Is there anything that's consistent? Is there things, so leadership, community connection, how you do like anything in those areas. And I basically wrote a very long statement of intent that had multiple different paragraphs that could be used. And then when I had to do a statement of intent, I would go through all of the paragraphs were themed. So like leadership, community connection, this section's for Indigenous awards. And then I would just copy and paste through the paragraphs a statement of intent. And then I would edit it so it would kind of flow together. And that's what I would submit. It made it very fast. And they were things that I knew would be well. And that was through working either through myself. Sometimes it was asking other people for help. So again, those faculty connections. And in some cases, accessing like writing tutors, the writing center, really taking advantage of those things that UBC gave me to help me excel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was helpful, but it was very long. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Denali actually has kind of the same thing, a content question. How much do you want to focus on the academic part, like literature, previous research, gaps in research, versus your motivational intent? Like, how do you balance those things within the letter?
I think it's super award specific, quite frankly. I feel like a lot of these questions come back to what are you applying to and what are they looking for? So if they give you a rubric, awesome. So I can say, because I know that you're in grad school, you're doing your PhD. We have a graduate research award, and our statement of intent, they're looking for, I'm trying to remember what our rubric says. We ask you for like 2 reference letters. One has to be from your research supervisor who talks about like your research and your ability to do this research and that.
Right.
Your CV, so like your achievements are really going to be in your CV.
Mm-hmm.
But then in our actual statement of intent, what we're looking for is the impact of your research on Aboriginal health and wellness in our communities. So we had one statement of intent, and the person, I think, they got a very high level of funding, and they addressed the academic parts. But they talked about like the research gaps, the gaps in research, but they tied it to there's this gap. This is why I'm doing my research. This is what motivates me. And here's how my research is going to fill that gap and then contribute to the health of Aboriginal people in this and this way. And I think they got like the highest award we've ever gotten, if I recall correctly, or one of them, like a very like several $1,000s high amount. It's really the other thing too about these statements of intent and the essays is I kind of think of it like a little bit like creative writing. It's like you're writing like a creative nonfiction piece about who you are. And I don't know how much creative writing other people have done And people always make fun of me because I have an arts degree. And they're like, you'll get nothing with that. I'm like, I kind of, I guess, kind of, but I can write these things very well. That was the number
Mm.
one thing that came out of
Mm-hmm.
it. And we see it a lot, what I see with applications to programs as well, where you have to write these personal essays. Med school, pharmacy, broad-based admissions for undergrad is we want to know about you, and it's all about show, not tell, which is something that comes up a lot in creative writing.
Right.
It's something that they try to teach you in school. This idea of writing is showing, not telling. So it's a difference between me saying to you, I'm very good at, think about it, I'm very good at doing presentations.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, okay, they're telling me that, but how do I know that? Whereas me writing you something saying, I do presentations in my work, and part of that is engaging with people, and this is how I engage with people, and these are the outcomes that we've seen,
Mm-hmm.
or what, like
Right.
whatever. So it's that idea of being a little bit more descriptive, so that people can hear about it. And I think it's as you're writing, as you're writing anything, it's
Mm-hmm.
tying that narrative together
Mm-hmm.
in a cohesive way.
Okay.
I
Cool.
don't know if that was helpful, but
No, super helpful.
that's what I think about.
So if I can try and summarize
Yeah,
a little
go
bit
for
what we
it.
talked about. So
Go for it.
rather than, in specific to Denali's question, rather than
Mhm.
trying to list a bunch of previous research and gaps of research,
Yeah,
or rather than just talking strictly about what the motivations are, your recommendation would be to try to strike a balance and maybe find like one or two kind of central gaps and talk about how your research addresses them
yeah,
and talk about why it is that you want to do that
yeah.
and just kind of follow each one through
Yes.
all the way through, so that again
Yeah.
it comes out as a narrative about
Yeah.
why it is that you do the research and why it is that the research is important.
Yeah, yeah,
Cool.
exactly.
Okay.
So it's like somebody like me who has not done research. I at least, if I read it, I'm like, cool, they're going to help fix this thing in health like this. It's really
Yeah.
just demonstrating. It's, I guess, in this context, there's a difference between saying my research will help Aboriginal health with nothing else, and that context of how it will,
Yeah.
it will improve and work toward it by addressing that gap.
Great.
That's
Awesome.
kind of with anything. I hope that was helpful.
No, it was great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Savanah.
Those were kind of the major points when I was thinking about statement of intent.
Great.
I don't know if there's any other questions that people have about them or things that you were wondering about. But the kind of last piece is talking about being Indigenous in the academy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I was really looking at this idea of the first one that I wrote down is really navigating what we call at UBC self-identity versus proof of ancestry.
Right.
So I don't know if we want to
Coming
move
back
to that.
Barb's question, I believe
Yeah.
it was. Yeah. Yeah. Let's. I'm good. Let's leave.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
We can leave it to the chat. If they have more questions they think about, throw it in. We'll go
Absolutely.
for it, I think.
Yeah. We can
Yeah.
go back to it for sure.
So this is probably the hardest one, I think. And it's the most, I don't want to say fraught, that's like a word, but it is. It has so many complexities and moving parts, and even saying proof of ancestry is gross to me.
Yeah.
I hate that. And there's no good way to ask that question, I think. This is where you get my personal feelings about this, but it bothers me immensely, especially within the institution. I see it really a lot because when you're within UBC, there's this really big fear that people are going to like lie about being Aboriginal to take advantage of everything and get this money. And I understand that. I understand where people are coming from, but at the same time, I think it put huge barriers on students and their ability to apply and feeling like they can own their Indigenous identity, however that shows up for them. So if you get someone like me who is Indigenous and I have a status card, but I look like this,
Mm-hmm.
like if I was to apply to something and you saw a photo of me, you may not think I was Indigenous. And then you get these questions.
Yeah.
And then it wouldn't be until I'm like, here's this card. So that I think is the biggest piece, is figuring out how to navigate that both within yourself and within the institution, and what the difference means. So with our awards, it was really important to me to use self-identity. So basically what that means is that when you apply on the application form, you just check off. You're like, I can't remember how we worded the question, but you're basically just saying, yep, I'm Aboriginal. And if you like, you can tell us if you're like First Nations, Inuit, Métis. And then we believe you, unless you give us a reason not to.
Right.
Rather than coming into the conversation with everyone who applies is going to lie about this, and we need this. And that's not to say that programs that do that think that, but for me, when I was a student, that's kind of sometimes how it felt like. And I also remember, because I came from New Brunswick, being shocked, like when I applied to UBC undergrad years ago, and they didn't ask me for my status card. They just like self-identity. They were just like, "Cool, you said this, we believe you," and that was game changing to me because it had been the first time in my life I didn't have to prove to someone that I was what I said I was. So that's why it's really important to me that we do that. Some people will ask me, "Well, then how do you like know if people are lying?" And I think it can sometimes be one, the benefit of telling people we believe you when you say that you are this and that you count and that you are right. And also for people who don't have a status card, proof of ancestry is so hard to get.
It's very difficult.
It's very difficult, and if you're Métis, then it's even harder, and it's just
sure.
It's not fair, I think. And for us, because we do self-identity and our awards are for Aboriginal students, it then comes through in the rest of the application. So that's really like in your statement of intent, and that's something that students will ask about is if, how do we phrase it? We're all on a different path of where we are in navigating our identity and being Indigenous in this world and being Indigenous in the institution, the different intersections and how these things show up. And the number one kind of trepidation that I see or questions we get from adjudication committees is, well, how are we defining this? And what I tell students is in the statement of intent, we talk about who you are and what you're about. If you're really at that beginning phase and you don't know a lot about being Indigenous, because I really knew nothing about my heritage, just because of the circumstances of life, and I had to go through a lot of this learning and pacing, you can tell us that in your letter, especially if it's an Indigenous award. You can, as part of that, it locates us, it gives us your context, so then we see where you're coming from as a student. That sometimes proof of ancestry doesn't. You will get awards. Inspire is one of them that wants proof of ancestry. Yeah. And then it's navigating what does that look like for you, and then you have to ask the program, and it's so different for everything. And then this also includes applying to programs. Yeah. And again,
some awards will accept like a letter from a band affiliation if you have that. But it's really
it's really hit or miss. I know that there's some places will take a long form birth certificate or a parent status card, so if your parents are status and you aren't. I've seen some people who've done like significant family tree research. One thing that I have heard people talking about, and we're looking at this identity piece, is DNA tests. So if you do like 23andMe, and some people be like, "Oh, I'm Aboriginal," and they'll try to submit that, and that's tricky just in that, like, as of right now, those tests are kind of more for like entertainment rather than like here's a definitive proof. And also sometimes when you're talking about like being Indigenous in these awards, especially ours that are looking for like how are you working with community, like either with your community or like with like the UBC community, with the Downtown East Side community, the Aboriginal community. How does you being Indigenous and coming through that process helping? And I think that's really that difference. So if you were just like, cool, like I just did this test, I found out I'm Indigenous today, and then apply to awards tomorrow, but you don't really know what that means and how that shows up for you and the impact it could make. I think that's a difference. And also they're not really scientifically valid yet as a statement. I don't know if that was helpful, but those are just a stream of consciousness thought of all the questions that I get from students when I think about this area.
I think the one thing I kind of wanted to add here is that, like, basically just to reiterate what you said, and that it's going to come out in the application. If you're somebody that comes from community, or if you're very invested in whatever that community means for you. I've been in Vancouver for 6 years now, and you can find Indigenous community within the city here. I was very involved with the Indigenous community here on campus, based out of the Longhouse. A lot of work in with other communities around the area. So it really is what you define it, or what you come to define it for yourself. But just talk about it in the application, because it's going to come out. And absolutely, it doesn't matter if you're going for an award or for a program or whatever. They're all looking for that. If you're going to go through the Indigenous application process, whatever that is, either for specific awards or there's specific streams for certain programs, if that's something you've indicated, it is something you're going to want to talk about in the application, or that's going to start to like you kind of alluded to raise red flags as to, okay, why is this person going through this process, right? So that would be the only thing. And if you're not very well connected, if through life's life situations, if it doesn't happen for you, like Savannah said, just be really honest about it up front. Um, and honestly, in my experience anyway, through my award application and all that sort of thing, is that is taken into account. You know, if
Yeah.
you're not super well connected, but you're making
Yeah.
efforts at doing that, then write about that. Absolutely. Or if you come from community and you've been in Vancouver for
Yeah.
5 or 6 years now, and you don't really know anybody at the band office anymore, then
Yeah.
talk about the work that you do here, right?
Yeah.
Or wherever it is that you're based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's yeah. I think that's like the most important thing because the thing that I always kind of come back to, and you end up in this I say interesting this space. I feel like sometimes when you're Indigenous, like a lot of your experience is navigating how do I be Indigenous and what does that mean and like
Yeah.
that reconciliation piece. Sometimes I think it's like reconciliation within myself is how I think about it. Like
For sure.
that discovery and that getting to that phase. I think it's really thinking about for me it was really kind of defining what do I consider like I have like for me it was I have this physical proof that says I'm Indigenous and what does that mean to me
Yeah.
and how does that impact my life and my motivations and does it impact and I think for me if it ultimately had been it didn't then I would not self-identify as Indigenous and I think that's also kind of it. It's like what does it mean to you, how are you defining it, what does it look like for you, and I had to really do a lot of work. And a lot of that was while I was going through my undergrad and then coming into the beginning kind of parts of my career was really working out what does it mean to me to be Indigenous? How am I defining community? Because for a long time I thought, well, I don't know. I never was in my home community. I guess that means I'm not Indigenous. And that wasn't the case. It was just figuring out what that meant for me. So if the committee knows how you're approaching, how you see the world, your context, it's so much easier for them.
Sure.
And it's the students who, and that's when it comes back to that authenticity, genuineness. Like, how do you show up? Because I think, like, I've never been big into hunting, for example. That's not something that I would do to connect to being Indigenous. But a lot of students think that we'd only be looking for very traditional, like, really traditional activities.
Yeah.
So if I was to write a statement of intent and talk about how like I'm always I'm always hunting on the land and this is what I do and I don't do that, it doesn't come off as genuine.
Yeah.
Because my way of being Indigenous in the world is not that, and that's still okay. It's just the committee needs to see that.
For sure.
But then I think the other piece when I talk about indigenating the academy that I just thought about is that how you then use that when you're applying to awards that aren't looking at you being Indigenous. And how does that factor into play?
Right.
And that's something I don't really have an answer for because it's hard, but it's a conversation that keeps coming up with our students that's now starting to happen at UBC. Yeah, especially with our graduate students is if I'm getting awards that have Indigenous in the title or this is like my research, is that going to pigeonhole me? Is that going to negatively affect me? How do we navigate that? How do we work with that? And I think these are the conversations that aren't had but are so useful to have if you just open that dialogue.
Yeah.
I think I've had students when I've kind of touched on this a little bit who have gone, I've never thought about this. No one's ever told this to me, but this is something that was limiting me from doing XYZ. Thank you for acknowledging this. And I think just having someone say it is super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, I'm going to let you go. Talked a lot. You go for it.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what we're talking about here, and the only other thing I wanted to touch on a little bit in terms of on that aspect, in terms of being pigeonholed into doing those sorts of things, is that ultimately it's totally up to you, and I think that there are some genuine concerns about that sort of thing, especially like you said for grad students that need to kind of compete in a larger world, let's say, in terms of research funding. I chose to stick to mostly Indigenous streams because these were the people that I knew and that I felt comfortable with, and it worked out okay for me as an undergrad. That would be the only personal experience that I can kind of share with you guys, is that I didn't really need to look for external sources because there were so many sources. And we're talking about Inspire, we're talking about the awards at UBC, we're talking about other external organizations like the Relationship Trust that we talked about before, right? Like there were so many, and my band had specific scholarships as well that were just for my band. So I didn't need to look out for it, but it really depends a lot on what your career goals are. And I agree, at a grad level, that can be a really tricky conversation for sure.
Yeah. The other thing that I think about, I think that this also ties into then your career. And it's
Mm-hmm.
something that I've seen and I've started kind of working through. Um, so I almost all of my work experience has been working with either with university and government and with community, but it's all been working with Indigenous people, communities, work in one way or another. So what I've discovered has kind of happened, especially because I've been making a really big point of going into non-Indigenous spaces and talking about what I do, is that people have this like notion that they're like, oh, you only do Indigenous work. And they
Mm-hmm.
don't realize that a lot of the things that I do in my job, not just this, like a lot of this information is very much information I could give to anyone. It's just adding that Indigenous worldview, that the knowledge about like Indigenous students on top of it. It's just like a layer of frosting, but the base is the same.
Yeah.
Um, and some of the work that I've been doing to talking with people and the spaces that I run in. So I'm sure you know me, we work together. So I'm a coach and we have a coaching program at UBC, tangent, but I got into that program to be a coach at UBC because there's no self-identified Aboriginal coaches
Mm-hmm.
within that program. And I realized that that would be a huge resource for people. And through the work I've done there, I'm realizing that people don't really see that. And, so, and for some reason, that they see Indigenous work is very esoteric and over there. And what is that?
Yeah.
And inaccessible. And they don't realize that it's really just kind of a lot of the base stuff is the same. It's just the frosting that's different
Mm-hmm.
and that context.
Mm-hmm.
As much as if you worked with international students or were applying to international awards, it's like
Yeah.
the mechanisms of XYZ are the same, but you have that like international
Yeah.
frosting, that layer, that intersection.
Still need to have a reference letter. Still need to
Yeah,
have a
exactly.
statement of intent. Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that you can think about when you're looking at how do I integrate having all this Indigenous experience or these things on my CV with like non-Indigenous awards, for example.
Mm.
For me, it's really just been telling people, hey, I do all of this, but also you then get this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because for me, it's my job, but it's so valuable for units to have people who either are Indigenous and have this context or who are very strong allies who know and understand
Mm-hmm.
working in roles that aren't just Indigenous specific, because then you can bring that knowledge everywhere and it benefits all of us.
Totally.
And then you end up with that momentum and you go. And it
Yeah.
just carries on. And I can see how those ripples through the work I've done and the work I've done with non-Indigenous staff that I've worked with has kind of carried on. And I think that's really lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something when I think about how do you navigate that is I keep that in mind. And I think, okay, well, if I have to write a statement of intent, then maybe I'll put that in there
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to see it anyway. And I may as well address it before they see it.
Absolutely.
And or if they make that assumption, then I'll try to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to do that, but
But it's a
I'm all
reality.
and I'm all about being strategic and getting as much money as possible.
Absolutely. Own your
So, yeah.
space, own your identity.
Yeah, own it.
And that's what it comes down to. So thanks very much for your
You're
time
welcome.
today, Savanah. I really appreciate it. We'll let the chat go for a little bit
Yeah.
longer. If you have any last questions for Savanah about anything we talked about today, please feel free to put it in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
As just a general outro, we have a lot of really exciting sessions coming up for February. Next week, we'll have Cease coming in to talk to us about traditional medicines. The week following, we'll have a session with Kim Haxton from Indigenize. She's going to talk to us about the role of an ally, and then following that, we'll have Dr. Bain Smith over conference call to talk to us a little bit about functional medicine and what that is and how that can kind of impact communities. So we're pretty excited about February. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. Yeah, we'll make sure to put like I said before, make sure to put all these resources out so you'll have all of them. If anybody wants to get in contact with Savanah specifically, I'm sure if you're thinking about coming to UBC, that would probably be a really great resource to put out there. So just reach out.
Yes.
We'll make sure to connect you to the right people in the right places.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're getting a lot of thanks from Andrea, thanks from Denali, thanks very much to everybody in the Zoom chat box that participated. It was
Thank you, guys.
fantastic. Yeah, we really enjoy the participation from all of you. So I think that's about it from all of us at the Learning Circle. I wanted to again say thank you very much. I hope you have a great day. Yeah, goodbye for now.
Yeah, thank you.